Hey,
Good
all
morning. Good morning. This is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo. And the graphics today, some of them at least, are by Terry Spataro. And thank you, Terry. And the presentation today is the Future Evolution of Consciousness webinar series, Module 6, Part 2 on reciprocity and consciousness. Part 1 is already available for viewing up on the YouTube Center for Future Consciousness channel. And just to refresh our memory, in part one, I talked about introducing a second basic principle in understanding consciousness and the future, reciprocity, in addition to the concept of evolution, which I had talked about in several previous webinars. I introduced the concept of reciprocity by looking at theories of dual consciousness, in particular, Eastern versus Western paradigms of consciousness between conceiving of reality as a circle versus conceiving of reality as a line, where conceiving of it as a circle corresponds or lines up with the idea of reciprocity, and conceiving of it as a line, a direction, aligns up with the Western idea of evolution. I use the Taoist Yin-Yang as a fundamental archetypal image and definition of the meaning of reciprocity. And then we talk quite a bit on how the concept of reciprocity applies to the theory of open systems. And this gives us a way to understand life and humanity in terms of reciprocal open systems. And then finally, in part one, I talked about the connection and relationship between reciprocal evolution, where reciprocal realities mutually stimulate each other and provoke each other into mutual evolution, and how they fit together with purposeful evolution, which I talked about in several earlier webinars. Part two today, we're going to be talking specifically about ecological psychology, that is focusing in on how we can understand how the concept of reciprocity applies to psychology, which will be very illuminating with respect to understanding consciousness. And then I'll compare together the notion of reciprocity and dualistic thinking on consciousness in the world. I will talk about reciprocity and epistemology, that is, how the concept of reciprocity applies to understanding human knowledge and its relationship with reality. And then finally, I'll talk about applying the concept of reciprocity to evolution and time. And that'll wrap it up for webinar 6, part 2. So to begin, I have a quote here on reciprocity and ecological psychology. For things are things because of mind, as mind is mind because of things. Sin Sin Ming, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And what's getting highlighted in that quote is that the reality of things is, in some sense, conditioned or dependent upon the mind. But the mind, in turn, is conditioned in some sense and dependent upon things. We go in a loop. And this again returns us to this notion of reciprocal independence. Now, what particularly I'm going to be talking about under ecological psychology is the reciprocal relationship between human psychology and the environment. And I'm going to start at a foundational level of perception, proprioception, and behavior. That is to see how reciprocity applies to psychology, in particular with respect to perception and proprioception and behavior. And a main source for these ideas I will be presenting is J.J. Gibson's ecological psychology. On the left side of the screen, there's a picture of Gibson. There aren't very many pictures of Gibson, it turns out. And Gibson was a scholar, a scientist, a psychologist that I studied with back when I was in graduate school. My first book, in fact, was a book dealing with Gibson's ecological psychology. And a copy of an image of the book is up there, The Reciprocity of Perceived Environment. Gibson's last book that came out, I think, in 1979, the image of it is up there too, The Ecological Approach to Visual Perception. And Gibson was one of those very inventive and interesting characters that I bumped into throughout my life. And I think I'd mentioned before in an earlier part of this webinar that there are several very fascinating and creative thinkers I will be talking about today, and Gibson is one of them. Gibson had as central to his ecological psychology or ecological approach to psychology the concept of reciprocity. That is, the perceiving, behaving animal and the environment form a reciprocity. They are distinct but mutually interdependent realities, meaning that one cannot understand the perceiving, behaving animal, and we're animals as part of the class, independent of understanding its relationship with the environment. And I took this basic starting point in Gibson fundamental idea as one main critical way to approach and critique philosophical dualism, in particular mind-matter dualism, separating the mind from the physical world. Gibson saw them as reciprocally interconnected together. So the main capacities and features of the perceiving, behaving animal, including us, can only be understood and defined relative to the environment and vice versa. They are distinct, but they are interdependent. Now, a key example of applying reciprocity to the animal and the environment are the dual concepts of effectivities and affordances. So when we try to describe the behaviors of animals and humans, it's important to see how those various behaviors actually are geared toward having effects upon the environment or engaging in various relationships with the environment. So that things like walking or breathing or throwing objects or communicating or eating or having sex or any of the main dimensions of animal and human behavior will always involve some kind of manipulation and effect and changing relationship that the animal or the person is intending to achieve with respect to the environment. So when we behave, we don't simply move muscles. We behave in order to affect the world that we are in. So the way we need to understand behavior is in terms of the intended effects that we are attempting to produce within that environment. So you can't talk about behavior independent of the environment. The reverse or reciprocal concept of affordances is that when we perceive and attempt to understand our environment, we perceive and understand it in terms of the functions and the uses that it has for us. An affordance is defined as the function or uses that some feature of the environment has for the behaving living organism. So, affordances would be things like the ground affords walkability. We can walk on it. Various vegetables and fruits afford edibility. They're things that we can consume. Other members of our species afford sociability or communication or cooperation or even antagonism. That is, the features of the environment that we pay attention to are the features that are uses and functions that that environment has for us. Now, of course, then, different animals, because of different types of structures that they have or size or behaviors, there will be different types of affordances for them in the environment depending on their particular capabilities. So, affordances are relative concepts in that an affordance is not understood as something intrinsic to the physical world, to the environment. It's understood as a relational property that the physical world has, or the physical environment has, with respect to the capacities and the desires and the mentality of the organism, the animal, the human that we are thinking about. So they're entirely relative. And one could suppose that affordances are describing the environment as affordances, that affordances are not real properties of the environment, they're only relative properties of the environment. But something that I discuss in my book, The Reciprocity of Perceived Environment, is a general point that was made by Bertrand Russell, famous 20th century philosopher, in discussing the nature of scientific knowledge. And Bertrand Russell pointed out that the various properties that we study, are aware of, attempt to understand in the universe around us, we only know and understand those properties in terms of the effects that those properties have upon us or our measuring instruments. That is to say, Russell is arguing that all of scientific knowledge, everything that we know through science, is built upon an understanding of relational properties that the world has with respect to our ability to perceive and understand and measure it. So everything we know is made up out of relational properties. Affordances are relational properties in that affordances are the uses or functions that the environment has for animals, and of course, it will vary depending on the particular animal. And so Gibson wanted to challenge a fundamental idea that has been around in philosophy, in particular, psychology and science, for a long time. That is, the question of whether the world that we live in, the environment that we are in, whether that environment, that physical world, is meaningful or whether rather meaning is something that the human mind gives to the world. Now, I have another quote up here from Gibson. What a thing is and what it means are not separate, the former being physical and the latter mental, as we are accustomed to believe. That is to say, what Gibson is arguing for there is even though we distinguish between what something is and what it means, that's a false distinction. That what something is what it means to us. That is, our understanding of the world is in terms of the meanings that the world has for us. And meaning is not something simply in my mind, but meaning is something in the relational properties that the world possesses with respect to us. Affordances indeed are meanings. So, for example, edibility, attractability, throwability, whatever the particular affordance we're going to identify, those are meaningful aspects of the world. So, in Gibson's mind, we perceive and behave with respect to the meanings that the environment has for us. So we're engaged in this interdependent relationship with this meaningful environment, attempting to, in various ways, adapt, adjust, cope with, understand, manipulate it. So basically, reciprocity here as a starting point means that the perceiving, behaving animal and the meaningful environment are understood in terms of an interdependent relationship where they're distinct, but in fact, they are interdependent. The affectivities, the behaviors that we engage in the use and manipulation of the affordances of the world, of the environment. Now let's go a little bit further with this. Um, Another book that Gibson had written a bit earlier, The Senses Considered as Perceptual Systems, which in fact was the first book by Gibson that I read, um, Gibson lays out a different theory of the sensory systems in this book, very different from what it normally would be. Now, the place he starts, though, is with attempting to understand the environment that we perceive, that we interact with, not at the level of microscopic or submicroscopic physics, but rather at a much more holistic level in terms of objects and pathways and obstacles and other living organisms. If you remember, I had earlier discussed the notion of holarchies and hierarchies, that nature was a series of levels of more complex and holistic realities, which have built up from simpler realities. And so the reality of animals and plants and humans is at a different level of organization, but it is just as real as the level of subatomic particles. Very often it is argued that the universe really just consists of subatomic particles and patterns and wavefronts of energy, which is referred to as physical reductionism. But that's very misleading because the universe that we're in is not one single level, it's multiple levels of organization. The world that we perceive is, of course, not the world of quarks and electrons, it's the world of plants and rivers and animals. It's at a higher level of organization and complexity. So Gibson rejects physical reductionism as a correct description of the world that we're in, the universe that we're in, because it's simply one level among many levels. Now, physical reductionism is sometimes coupled together with the notion of absolute objectivism, that there is a reality that is independent of our awareness of it, and that science somehow gets at this absolute, or attempts to get at this absolute objective reality. But as I've already started to explain here, the world that gets perceived, the world that gets understood, is a world that reveals itself, and we make sense of it because of its impact, its connection with us. And we'll come back again to this idea of absolute objectivism and whether indeed there is an absolutely objective reality. But in Gibson's way of looking at the environment, he did not see the environment as some kind of absolute objective reality. He saw it as a complex, holistic, relational reality relative to us, a holistic ecological level of reality, which in fact surrounds us. So he was very critical of the notion that we don't perceive the real world. We perceive the real world, but we perceive the real world at the holistic ecological level. Of course, there are other levels of reality, atoms and electrons and various microscopic creatures, etc., or gigantic realities like superclusters. No, we don't perceive those. We perceive a certain level of complexity with respect to ourselves. But it's not any less real than any of the other levels are. He also argued against looking at the brain as a receiver of input because, as he described it, our perceptual systems, such as our visual perceptual system, our auditory, our tactual perceptual systems, all of those are active, exploratory, engaging, open systems that anticipate and guide the behavior of animals and humans. So we don't simply open ourselves to the world, rather, we engage the world. We look and we listen and we touch. So to think of the brain and the sense organs as housing consciousness inside of it is misleading. That is, it's not us looking at some kind of internal representation of the outside that's coming into us. Rather, perceptual consciousness facilitated through active, engaging perceptual systems is an outer directed interface with a holistic ecological reality. So, again, just so that that makes sense, instead of seeing perception as an inner conscious reality created by the brain and the sense organs inside of us that doesn't really correspond with the actual real world out there, presumably of atoms and electrons. Rather, we should think of it as we have active perceptual systems which explore and engage the world as open systems, and perceiving is not looking at some inner representation, or perceptual consciousness is not that, but rather perceiving is an active, outgoing interfacing with this holistic reality. Now we'll bring in another idea that has to do with, that illustrates the idea of reciprocity. Perception and proprioception. When people think about consciousness, they often will assume or argue that self-consciousness is something that emerges at some level of evolutionary development, and self-consciousness is not something that's there, perhaps in more primitive animals. Self-consciousness is some higher level of consciousness that comes later. But when Gibson thought about our perceptual consciousness, he noted that we are actually simultaneously aware of the environment around us. We see, we hear, we feel it, and we'll call that perception. But we are also concurrently feeling and seeing ourselves in relationship to that environment. So it's not simply that when I move about, I see the ground. Rather, as I'm moving about, I see the ground, but I also see myself in relationship with the ground. I see where my body is and my feet are. This second type of sensory awareness he called proprioception. And proprioception at the fundamental level is a sensory awareness of my body in the world. Perception is an awareness of the environment relative to me, whereas proprioception, the reciprocal, is an awareness of myself relative to the environment. Without that second component of sensory awareness, animals would be dysfunctional. It's not enough to see the apple that I want to eat. I have to see and be sensitive to where my hand is and how it's moving in relationship to the apple in order to grab it and bring it to my mouth. So that seeing or perceiving the world isn't enough. I have to perceive myself in relationship to the world for my behavior to be appropriate and to function properly. But what Gibson seems to be saying here then is that fundamental sensory consciousness, and this would apply to any animal that has to move about and manipulate the environment through behavior of its own body, that for any animal, there is going to be a I, other, a proprioceptive and perceptual pole to it. Both are necessary. So when I contemplate this, I can ask myself, and this would be a question you could ask yourself. This idea seems to imply that ants are self-conscious. Now, they're fairly, I'm just using a fairly relatively primitive creature here. Of course, you could say ants are very complex in a lot of ways. But if I were to be asking, are insects self-conscious? Well, insects are self-conscious insofar as they have to be sensory, there has to be sensory awareness of their body and how it's moving with respect to the environment that they're in, or else their behavior would be dysfunctional. They wouldn't, what is the point of being aware just simply of the world? They have to see where I am in the world. I have to feel where I am in the world. So sensory consciousness is ecological. It's an I and other in relationship to each other that begins at a very primitive level, the awareness of the body with respect to the environment, but it's a fundamental level of consciousness that exists all the way down to the most primitive levels of sensory consciousness. This ecological awareness, this I and the other in relationship to each other, is necessary for there to be appropriate behavior. So there's a primordial self-awareness in consciousness that's an ecological awareness of me in relationship to the world, and it's a dynamic one too, right from the get-go. So the idea of reciprocity applied here is that not only do I perceive the world, but I also proprioceptive myself, and I am aware simultaneously of the two in relationship with each other as distinct, but also in a dynamic, ongoing, changing relationship. And that awareness is fundamental to sensory consciousness. It's a awareness of the reciprocal nature of my own existence at a sensory level. And that becomes the foundation of more elevated and complex types of self-awareness that come when we begin to think about ourselves. But first of all, we feel ourselves, see ourselves in the world to start with. Now, this next slide I put up here is an image, what Gibson referred to as an optical tunnel. And one should have the impression looking at it of a receding tunnel going off into the distance. Perhaps there's a dark cave there in the middle, but you should have a definite impression of a tunnel effect, visual effect here. And you'll notice that the individual units of dark and light, whether they're the half circles or the squares, get smaller and smaller and more clustered together as we move from the perimeter toward the center. This is a stimulus gradient. It's a pattern in the light that's being presented to us when we look at it. And it's a pattern in the light that usually will generate in us, we will see a receding surface. And in fact, receding surfaces do generate this particular kind of pattern of light. Now, I brought that up because this next topic here, the revelation of the environment and the cosmos, I'm taking as a starting quotation here. The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible, Albert Einstein. How is knowledge of the world possible? What is it about the universe that makes it knowable and comprehensible? And Gibson had an answer to this, which helps us to further understand the ecological nature of our consciousness. And his answer was, if you stop for a moment and consider the environment that surrounds us, one should note that off of the surfaces and from all different elements and pieces out there in the environment, there are complex energy patterns being generated and propagated out through the medium. Now, remember from open systems theory, in open systems theory, a open system is an entity which interacts with its environment. It both takes stuff in and emanates energy and matter outward. The environment around us, all of the different surfaces, all the different objects in it, all of them are through reflecting light, through vibrations, through various other forms of energy, are propagating out into the medium this complex pattern of energy. And this complex pattern of energy, in fact, is a consequence of the structure and dynamics of that environment that is generating it. So if we look around, obviously we note that we see all these different objects surrounding us, and every one of these objects has surfaces, and these surfaces are all reflecting light, and the light patterns from all those surfaces are converging at me at this particular observation point. The top diagram there shows two different positions of a perceiver, sitting, standing, and how the perspective structure of the light changes as the head moves from one position to another position. And indeed, as you move your head around, the pattern of converging light will change depending upon where you're positioning your head. Gibson had a whole area of study which he called ecological optics, which was concerned with studying the patterns of light being generated by the environment and how those are related to the structure in the environment. And there's a definite strong relationship between what's out there and the light that's reaching our eyes, the structure in the light. As he put it, there's information about both myself and the environment around us and the patterns of energy that are converging on me. So the question of how is knowledge possible, one starting point here is that the world that we understand, the universe that we understand, is open systems which generate patterns of energy, and those patterns of energy correspond to the nature of those systems, reflect it, so that the universe manifests itself to us through energy, through patterns in energy. It's not closed off from us, but rather it's open and it's perpetually broadcasting its presence and the nature of its presence to us. But I need to also mention, and this will be taken in the second diagram down below, animals move about, and when they move about, the patterns of energy reaching them are continually transforming. And the bottom image there shows a representation of how the pattern of energy, the structure of it, changes as a consequence of coming into a landing strip when the observer indeed is in motion. So as we move about, various patterns in the array begin to expand and move out toward the sides of our field of view. There's an optical flow pattern. And these are optical flow patterns that are used all the time when airplane pilots are being trained. But they're optical flow patterns that you could see if you just simply go walk out on the street and watch how perspectives on objects are changing and moving out from a central point in the field of view. This is patterns of energy too. And in fact, when we move, we're better able to perceive the world than when we're standing still because the energy patterns become more complex and revealing. An example that I often will use in this regard is that if someone puts an object in your hand and you're not allowed to move your hand, you may have trouble figuring out what the object is. But if you're allowed to move your fingers around and explore the object, producing this changing pattern of energy on your fingertips, the nature of the object becomes much more clear and vivid to us. So actually, a moving stimulus array is more revealing than a static stimulus array. So the universe manifests itself to us, it makes itself knowable because it emanates structured energy, which is continually converging on us from all around us. So it isn't that it's closed off or separate, it's that we are in that environment and surrounded by the energetic manifestations of what is in that environment as a conscious observer. We're perceiving it from within and we're continually having these patterns of energy reaching us from around us that are specific to what's out there in the world. I like this image because it gives us a sense of the relationship between ourselves and the world around us, in that you could see it as patterns of light converging on the observer. And this particular diagram representation is a good representation of this vision of the ambient optic array. Actually, the converging point should be at the eyes. Here, the artist put it in the center of the head, but still, you get the idea of patterns of light converging inward, that with us in the middle of it, perceiving what those patterns of light are revealing to us. Now, another reciprocity, an important one that comes up in Gibson, is the reciprocity and connection between invariance and change. Our environment is a combination of both relative stabilities, things that stay relatively stable, like the ground, and other things that involve relative change. And relative, of course, is relative. So we could be talking about changes occurring over a matter of seconds. We have the regular change of the night and day. We have changes that in the environment due to the movement of objects. There's other things in the environment that seem to stay relatively stable. And in fact, there's both relative stabilities and relative change, invariance and transformations in both our environment and in the ambient energetic array around us. And stability and change in Gibson's mind are reciprocal realities too, contrary to the notion that there's a world of change and then there's a world that stays the same, that somehow is eternal. In Gibson's mind, stability and change form a reciprocally interdependent reality. Normal moving observers move through a transforming arrays of light and sound, and things become more veridical the more we move about. That is, the more we produce stimulus change, the more the invariant features, the stable features of the environment get revealed. So, multiple perspectives, changing our perspectives, actually improves our knowledge and awareness of the world out there, of perceiving what's going on around us. Now, given that as an active moving perceiver, I'm always anticipating, exploring, initiating. I'm always um, being influenced by the memories that are going on inside of me. The distinction between perception and memory and anticipation blurs. Perception takes time. It doesn't happen in an instantaneous moment of the present. It involves perceiving stabilities across time, perceiving changes across time. So the foundation for thinking into the future and remembering the past actually begins in perception, because perception, in fact, involves this sense of what is occurring across time that is staying the same and what is occurring across time which is changing. It also is probably the foundation of abstraction and thinking, because we perceive relationships and invariance in the world around us. So when Gibson came to the point of how do we distinguish between the objective and the subjective, the objective or objective knowledge can be understood simply as what remains invariant across all perspectives. Objective is not something defined independent of subjective, but rather objective is what stays constant across all subjectivities. And so objective and subjective are not distinct because there's no absolute objective. Rather, objective is simply the invariant features that are revealed through moving exploration and multiple perspectives. This is on a continuum as opposed to a dichotomy. So we don't have a subjective world in our head and an objective world out there in reality. Rather, we have a combination of the two where there are things about this reciprocal relationship that remain objective, and there's things about it that simply are reflective of our unique points of view. But the only way we get at anything objective is simply by taking more and more unique points of view. Now, there's a lot of other things I could say about Gibson's use of reciprocity, about ecological psychology. What I said was simply some illustrations of it. Um, but I wanted to compare briefly Gibson's thinking of psychology in terms of reciprocity versus other people thinking of psychology in terms of dualism. The standard view throughout history has been that perceptual consciousness, my awareness of the world, and the physical world are distinct realms, a dualism. My conscious awareness embodies representations of the real world, but they're not really of the real world. Yet our everyday experience seems to be that we indeed are conscious of this physical world around us through our senses. And Gibson's way of coming at this was to argue that indeed we are directly aware of the environment around us. But it's not a separate, distinct reality from us entirely. It's an environment in relationship to us that we are directly aware of. We're not directly aware of atoms and electrons, but we can become aware of them more so through the use of instrumentation. But it's not like there is a inner realm which is separate from some objective outer realm. Rather, we are aware of a world from a point of view where that world we're aware of is a world relative to us. So our perceptual consciousness is embedded in this ecological reality. It's not something separate from it. It's not as if the material world is something separate from our consciousness. He's rejecting mind matter dualism. And there are other examples that Gibson uses of reciprocity too, like the self and the other are not two absolutely distinct things. They're understood in relationship to each other, and so is stability and change. So those are just some quick illustrations about reciprocity, Gibson ecological psychology, and its relevance to understanding consciousness, at least at the level of perception and the beginnings of self-awareness. But I want to go look at a particular puzzle here and something that needs to be discussed in a little more depth, having been kind of sitting there on the sidelines for a while, and we need to come back to it to make better sense out of it. The relationship between the knower and the known, between the study of knowledge and the study of reality, or what is the relationship between knowledge and reality? Now, this quote I have up here from the phenomenological philosopher Maurice Merleau-Ponty, it sounds a bit similar to the quote I put up before from the Chinese philosopher. In this case here, the quote reads, "The world is inseparable from the subject, but from a subject which is nothing but a project of the world. That is, me, the subject, the conscious subject, is somehow constituted by the world. And the subject is inseparable from the world, connected to that world, but from a world which the subject itself projects." Now, this is another illustration of this notion of a fundamental reciprocity between us, the subject, the knower, the conscious being, and the world that we exist within, that we perceive around us. That it's difficult, if not impossible, to disentangle the two. And each seems to be dependent on the other. Now, I should note, as a starting point here on this slide, that the descriptions of everything that I've examined in these webinars, evolution, open systems, scientific theories, the study of cosmic reality, the hierarchy of nature, open systems, everything we've talked about, everything I've talked about, has all been articulated and understood by me and by you to whatever degree you understand what I'm saying from the perspective of human consciousness. That is, the whole world that we are describing and think we understand, that whole world is framed within our consciousness. So if I say the theory of evolution is true, well, that's a conscious being talking, believing in a theory that that conscious being and other conscious beings have created, and everything else we might say, oh, the universe consists of quarks and electrons. Well, that's the creation of conscious minds too. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't quarks and electrons, but it's important to note that the idea of quarks and electrons and everything we know about quarks and electrons is framed and seen and conceptualized from the perspective of human consciousness. Although we can provide a physical foundation, the brain, the environment, for understanding consciousness, that postulated foundation is an expression of our consciousness. So, if I were to, for example, be in a physiological psychology lab, and we had up on a table an experimental subject, and I had their skull open and I was poking around with electrodes in their brain. And I was saying to one of my research associates that this organ right here, this physical organ, which I'm poking, is generating consciousness in the patient. And the patient reports memories or smells or various experiences. And so I say, must be true, a material physical explanation of consciousness makes sense because when I poke this physical object here, this person reports being conscious. But the thing to remember is that the, in quote, physical object on the table that the experimenter is poking and observing and talking about is being experienced and known and understood from the perspective of his consciousness. So if I was a idealist, I could say the brain there that you're talking about is nothing but an idea in your own mind, but you're talking about it as if it were something separate and distinct from that. So even if I do give a physical explanation, that physical explanation is being understood in terms of my consciousness and other human consciousnesses. So how can we talk about reality when everything that we know is simply in our consciousness? And how do we know if there's anything outside of our own consciousness? Now let's push this a little bit further. One of the most influential books of the philosophy books, the later part of the 20th century, was second part of the 20th century, was Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And there's a picture of Thomas Kuhn. Thomas Kuhn is the one who's responsible for popularizing the notion of paradigms and of paradigm changes. And a very fundamental thing that Thomas Kuhn pointed out in that book is that when a scientific paradigm, the dominant one, changes, when we go from Newtonian physics to Einstein physics or quantum physics, for example, the facts that presumably are being studied and understood within that paradigm, the facts change. The facts are not independent of the theory, the paradigm in which they are conceptualized. So when people talk about what are the facts, the fact of the matter is the facts we believe are the facts depend upon the paradigm of understanding that we are using to understand reality. So this is a simple way of bringing up the point that it appears that the things we call facts are always, in some manner or form, being theoretically articulated. That is, they're being understood in terms of a theory or of a paradigm. And the person sitting next to Kuhn there on the bottom image is Paul Feyerabend. And Paul Feyerabend, as well as Kuhn, I got the opportunity to listen to both of these people in person. And Paul Feyerabend is one of the great philosophers of the second half of the 20th century. And Feyerabend, in particular, in line with Kuhn, emphasized this point that what science at any time calls the facts depends upon the theory that the scientists accept that allows them to identify and interpret what those facts are. So it looks like the known is never independent of the knower. And in fact, to make the argument a bit stronger, the concept of the myth of the given is that there are certain fundamental facts of either the world or my awareness or of anything, which are simply presented or given to me or us, independent of our interpretation of them. So if I say, let's get the facts straight, what's given here? What are the fundamentals? Before we go about theorizing, Feyerabend and Kuhn's argument is going to be there ain't no such beast. There ain't no set of facts that exist independently that you could take as a starting point, because every fact we can come up with is a fact in terms of some theoretical framework. Consciousness is always active, selective, interrogative, interpretive. There is no given that we start from. So this really creates a problem in thinking about, can we really know anything at all since everything is being selectively interpreted by us? And this is why various people go in the direction of idealism, subjectivism, solipsism, relativism, postmodernism, where they give up on the idea that is any kind of objective truth because it looks like everything is relative to who the hell is understanding and interpreting it. But we still, though, make distinctions between belief and reality, truth and falsity. That is, we evaluate our beliefs, and we can evaluate our beliefs. So if I say, for example, that right now my face has turned green and I've developed the third eye, at least you can see the image of me on the screen and think Tom's hallucinating. Now, you could be here and make the same kind of judgment as well. That is, people do say things, quite frequently, in fact, that appear to be wrong. And we go about in various ways attempting to assess and correct those, in quote, mistaken beliefs. If everything was relative, nothing would be right and nothing would be wrong. But it appears that we can distinguish between what is more accurate versus what is false. And we do it constantly. But how do we do it? We do it using our consciousness. So I can consciously evaluate what you are saying and conscientiously do that in making determinations about whether your beliefs actually align with reality or not. But all I'm doing then is I'm attempting to use my consciousness in ways that are rigorous, intensive, standard bearing to evaluate other conscious beliefs. So I never really get at the ultimate reality, but I can improve upon my belief about what the about reality is by evaluating other people's and my own beliefs. So it's not that everything is entirely relative, but the fact is, no matter what I do, I'm simply going to continue to use my own consciousness to evaluate and distinguish between simply what is believed to be true versus what is more probably true. I make distinctions between true and false. So we better to say that there's a reciprocity between knowledge and reality, that you can't absolutely distinguish between the two. You can't, and here's I have a couple quotes from Feyerabend to add to this. The only absolute truth is that there are no absolute truths. Ultimate reality, if such an entity can be postulated, is ineffable, whatever that would be, because everything that I know about reality turns out to be theoretically interpreted. And can I really get at some kind of absolute objective truth? Well, it doesn't seem like I can, even if I can approximate more toward it and evaluate beliefs, even though I may change my mind about something later on. That's another little complication in all of this. Like the debate between Newton and Leibniz over whether space was absolute or relative. For 200 years, people thought Newton was right. And then in the early 20th century, people changed their mind and decided, no, Leibniz was right. Space is relative. So sometimes what seems to be wrong later turns out to be right. So there's no guarantees that even my present judgments on things will be correct. So here's a question to ponder. It's a variation on the old question about if a tree falls in the forest, does it really make a sound? Did the Big Bang happen if there was no one out there to observe it? And the response I put up here to worth pondering. The only meaningful sense in which it happened was insofar as we could know it happened. That is, the belief in an absolute unknowable reality doesn't make any sense. And so it was a question to ponder if my consciousness and the world are reciprocal to each other, and we start at the beginning with the Big Bang, and there's no consciousness then, did the Big Bang really happen? Since the reality as we understand it always seems to involve this element of consciousness in making sense out of the very nature of reality. So, one final theme here to introduce with reciprocity. Order and chaos and evolution in time. And here's a quote from John Gardner, a really good philosopher of the last century. We cannot dream of a utopia in which all arrangements are ideal and flawless. Life is tumultuous, an endless losing and regaining of balance, a constant struggle, never assured of victory. Nothing is ever finally safe. There's no utopia. There's no nirvana. There's no absolute peace and tranquility. Things always keep flipping on us, and no matter how secure we may feel, disaster, chaos may come back into the picture, could come back into the picture. And here we're going to come at another perspective on reciprocity, and this comes off of J.T. Frazier and his theory of time. J.T. Frazier was the founder and president of the International Society of Time. And in 19, and also I put up on the webinar a link to an article that corresponded with a talk I went to listen to by him. Here's some of his books up here. In 1979, I went to listen to Fraser talk at a series on the study of time, and it sounded interesting. And so I went and listened to this very dry individual who read his presentation off of his written paper. So he did everything wrong to engage the audience. But I found it probably one of the two or three most important lectures I ever went to listen to. And the lecture had to do with a critique of Plato's theory of eternity and time. And as I discussed earlier on in this webinar series, a common belief has been that the eternal realm created the temporal realm in some sense, is responsible for it, and that the eternal realm exists at a higher level of existence than the temporal realm. And the temporal realm is some kind of fall, some kind of corrupt version of the eternal realm. And what Fraser proposed in that presentation, and there is a paper which I have a link for, he proposed, let's turn Plato on his head, turn him upside down. He's got it backwards. Instead of eternity being the highest realm, eternity is the most primitive level of existence. And the evolutionary trajectory of time actually represents an upward, advancing, evolving, um, what construction of reality. That is, time is an ascension versus a decline or a fall. And the hierarchy of levels in the universe demonstrate an increasingly more complex temporalities that evolve and subsume the lower levels, beginning from the most primordial, timeless level of eternity. Sounds very abstract. That is, and this is a common theme running through history, at the foundation of things as is universal, pervasive, becoming and pure flux, chaos, where everything happens all at once and there is no time at all. It's pure being, pure becoming simultaneously. And there is a tension that's built into that fundamental foundation of reality, that totally amorphous, undefined beginning. And it's a tension or a dualism of stability and change or order and chaos, a fundamental tension. And in fact, as I read Fraser later on, in Fraser's mind, there is a core tension in existence between order and chaos, between being and becoming. And what we see in evolution is this process where that tension keeps making itself more complicated. That is, another way of saying this would be that at any level of evolution in the history of the universe, there is a fundamental conflict or tension between order and chaos or stability and change, and that tension is irresolvable, and that tension, that opposition, gives that level of reality its structure, both spatially and temporally. So I thought to myself, I think what Fraser is saying here is that um, Evolution, or in fact, in his mind, the evolution of time, is like a progressive series of yin yangs, where each yin yang generates a more encompassing complex yin yang, which then generates a more complex one out of that. And I actually did a diagram to illustrate this, which I call the rings of reciprocity. And it looks like an optical tunnel from Gibson. And when people ask me what it is, I tell them it's a image of the form of time. And the image of the form of time here is that evolution proceeds, moves along by the creation of more complex yin yangs, reciprocities, which build upon and subsume and advance over the previous ones. So this image represents time and evolution as a progressive, unending sequence of yin yangs or reciprocal relationships. So we'll never get rid of chaos. So we'll never get rid of disorder. We'll never get rid of change. We'll never get rid of imbalance. Nothing is ever finally safe, but that's the whole nature of the game. And without that, there wouldn't be any game at all. So in my mind, Fraser connects in with reciprocity in this interdependency of order and chaos. He connects in with reciprocity in that reciprocity is the form that evolution takes as it creates more complex versions and time itself evolves out of this. So, summary on reciprocity. I already talked about some of this at the beginning of part two. Eastern Western thinking, the Taoist Yin-Yang, the reciprocity of wholes and parts, uh, reciprocal evolution, and reciprocal evolution as it applies to life, applies to humanity, applies to psychology and society. And this part here I'm reviewing is from part one and connecting purposeful evolution and reciprocal evolution and why humans and technology form into cyborgs. Then this part two, I talked about Gibson's ecological psychology is a strong illustration of applying reciprocity to human psychology and to perceptual consciousness with effectivities and affordances and the ecological environment and proprioception and perception. Then I talked about the reciprocity of the knower and the known, of epistemology and ontology. And I ended with J.T. Fraser and the ongoing evolving reciprocity of order and chaos, of being and becoming, of yin and yang, which forms the pattern of time, which is an irreconcilable, never ending complication that emerges out of undifferentiated chaos and flow. So, our next webinar, Theories of Consciousness, June 21st, which is about 2.5 weeks away from today. And that brings us to a close. Thank you, Terry, for some of the graphics. This is a nice graphic Terry did for, I've used it as a good closing graphic, very cosmic. And we'll see you again soon.